our study, this study is also conducted by Honorata, Nyga-Łukaszewska, and Katarzyna, Stala-Szlugaj, so the Polish scholars. I think I saw Honorata, so maybe she might be able to answer if there's any question more about energy security side, because in this paper, my part was more about the analytical side, more methodological side, and it was supposed to present last year, but because of the COVID-19, of course, so it's a little bit becoming outdated. But anyway, I hope you will, at least understand our study. And the paper is already published from the MDPI sustainability. So if you want to read the full paper, you can check the title, and you should be able to read the full paper as well. Although I found some error in afterwards, but due to this presentation, I learned I need to revise some of the paper, but it's already published. So anyways, and this is contents of today's presentation. So mostly focusing on the method side, but I will discuss a little about like why the motivation and why we did this kind of study. And then, but the main part will be more on the method side and the results and what could be implicated from our analysis. And as concerns related to CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuel rises, shift from coal to natural gas is increasing in coal-dependent country like Poland. I think now, really, even like the coal-oriented country in Europe also have to shift to more renewable energy, but this time we didn't focus much on the renewable, but more from shift to coal to other fossil fuel like natural gas especially. And as Poland was during 2011 to 2017, almost 80% of the European production of hard coal was from Poland. So you see how much Poland is a strong coal-oriented country. It's been both mostly exporting historically, but recently also importing some of the coals from other countries. And for this energy security, I will explain later on in the literature review part, but still the definition of concept of energy security is ambiguous, ubiquitous, and widely disputed, and remains poorly or at least not clearly defined among scientists. And most of these studies are more from analyzed from like the value or ratio of import export. But in this study, we focus, as I saw on the goal, is to investigate the energy security issue from the price aspect. And in this study, so why we decided to do this kind of study was when we were looking for any Polish data for coal. We found there were two different price index for coal, which is the first one is PSCMI1, which is more coal oriented to the power market, or you can say electricity. And the other coal index was PSCMI2, which was more related to the heating industry of coal. And so using these two different types of domestic coal market, we hypothesized that since PSCMI1, it was named in the data, this was more related to the electricity or power industry, and power industry in Poland is highly dependent on the coal domestic production. So we were expecting this will be more highly related to the international coal market. In the study, we assumed the international coal market to be the largest coal market, which is Australia. So basically we tested the linkage between this domestic power related coal with Australian coal market. And the second hypothesis was since PSCMI2 was more related to the heating industry, and the heating industry nowadays, the increased use of natural gas in Poland is increasing for heating purposes. So we decided to check if this PSCMI2 might be more related to the international gas market, which we relied on the German border natural gas price. And for relevant studies, in the paper, we wrote more about like what types of studies there have been doing on the energy security. And one large field was still on like defining and try to find out a good index for energy security. And other studies trying to like find out the level of energy security has been mostly done from like the importing ratio or exporting ratio. And studies show that both for imports and domestic production may pose similar threats for supply security. So of course, the export or domestic value of the energy is important when considering energy security issue. However, not much have been done from just checking the market side, the price of the coal versus international linkage. So this is somewhat innovative part of our study. And this the studies I wrote in the using method, this is not really connected to the energy security, but since the study uses more of considering how the structural break in time series has been affecting the price linkages. So I just put in another study related to the methodology. And for assumptions of first building some theoretical models for this analysis, we defined that energy security could be analyzed from, it could be considered as stabilizing the price, and which is because we found from the IAEA paper that this is not maybe report, but unintended availability of energy sources at an unaffordable price. Energy security could be considered from this kind of price aspect. So in this study, we assume the energy security is more related to stabilizing the price, and thus we focused on the price dimension of energy security. And to find out the hypothesis just mentioned, we examined the price linkages between the two Polish domestic indices and the European gas and Australian coal price market. And the terms we used was 2011 to 2019, which was the longest time period which was available when we started the study. I think we started in 2019 or something, but yeah, anyway, this was available data when the study was first investigated. And as we were expecting, the effects of structural breaks or kind of time varying components within the time series data is very important. We were, initially set up both considering the linkages without considering such time series, time varying component. But first we tested the price linkages without considering such kind of structural break or time varying component. And this was, I think, people who've been doing time series analysis very familiar with it, but we use the Johansen test, which is very popular test for conducting co-integration type of tests. And then, because we were expecting such structural break or time varying component might be affecting the co-integration relationship, we first tested if the long run relationship is changing over time. And this was conducted by the so-called BRM-Martins test. And if we find that this test identifies some structural break should be considered when investing co-integration relationship, we perform the time varying co-integration with effects of breaks. And this was conducted by two types of tests. First was it's based on the Johansen test, but it's more recursive. So it's testing more, split data for, like, say, that term was from 2011 to 2019, but testing the co-integration for small size of sample within 2011 to 2019 up to, so how the relationship changed over this period. And another test was the Gregory Hansen test. This is also quite famous, but this was to test the co-integration test when effects of structural break is considered. And this was only, but considering one structural break in the time series, but it does at least consider the effects of structural break when testing co-integration tests. So we perform these types of tests. And for data, I think I explained a little bit, but the PSCMI1 first coal indexes is the steam coal fines sold to the power sector and industrial power plants. So basically more reflecting the power market or electricity market. And the second index is the PSCMI2, which is the steam coal fines sold to industrial and municipal heating plants, so which is more related to the heating sector and how the coal price reflects. So we expect this coal price, this PSCMI2 coal price will reflect the heating industry. And for the international gas and coal, the natural gas was the border price in Germany, and the coal price, we used Australian coal price. And this is because Australia has the largest exporting coal market. And this shows a graph of our price data we used. So as you see, the units in the vertical axis is different because the coal market was in the Polish zloty and zloty per gigajoule, and the German price was German and Australian was the US dollar price per. Anyway, the unit is a little different. So the unit was different. So in the actual analysis, we use logarithm of all the prices. So the price series were converted into logarithms when we performed the actual analysis. And as a prerequisite, you need to, for testing co-integration, as maybe people familiar with this type of test, you have to first test the stationarity and check if all the variables used in the analysis are integrated at the same order. So we performed the ADF, BP, and KPSS, and also the unit root with considering the effects of structural breaks. And all these, mostly these four tests at least identified that all the test variables are okay to use to be applied for co-integration tests. So the order was integrated at order one, at least after first differencing the data. So we decided to perform the co-integration test. And first, this result shows the result without considering the structural break. And we found, although the Polish coal market was not co-integrated with the international gas market, and also both two domestic coal market didn't have co-integration relationship, at least the coal market did have, at least the domestic Polish coal market did have relationship, long-run relationship with the international coal market. However, as I mentioned in the method section, this result might be biased because we believe there was effects from the structural break in the time series. So we performed if this co-integration might be time varying within the time frame we used. And this was conducted through the Bjarne's Martin's test. And the results tests, the knowledge note that time invariant. So at least in all the series, we found some rejection of the null hypothesis, suggesting that all the relationship at least contains some time varying component. So this signifies that the importance of performing co-integration tests with considering the effects of structural break. And first, we performed the recursive co-integration test. So this shows that each time frame how the co-integration was changing over time. And we found that at least for the coal between the international coal and the international gas and the PSCMI2, so the heating sector and the coal, have been changing at least after 2017, and also the coal and gas relationship, international coal and gas market has been changing after 2015. However, we couldn't find much change in the relationship between PSCMI1 and the coal market. So just from the recursive co-integration, it was difficult to find out much about how really the co-integration relationship have been changing. We also performs a Gregory-Hansen test, which considers the effects of the breakpoint in the time series. And this shows the result of the test. And although some of the significance level was very low, so 10% sometimes not be considered well, but in social science, sometimes 10% is okay. So based on 10%, I'll still doubt that it's very strong result, but at least for the international gas market and the PSCMI2, we have a long run relationship. So we can say that at least the heating market coal that is related to the heating market have some relationship with the international gas market compared to at least the PSCMI1, which reflects the power industry. And the other test, this was maybe not so strong result, but at least the international coal versus the PSCMI1 was significant at the 10% level. So compared to the PSCMI2, the PSCMI1 market has more linkage with the international coal market. So we find, generally summarizing from these analysis, we found that the power market-oriented coal is more related to the international coal market, while the heating market-oriented coal market is more related to the international gas market. Although this is only, tested, verified with the 10% level. So from these results, we found that the electricity sector exhibits energy security as long as the domestic coal market remains self-sufficient. And energy security might be questioned when considering the heating sector, because heating sector is more dependent on the natural gas market from the our long-run relationship tests with the German border natural gas price. So this implies that the energy security has to be discussed in the context. It depends on which kind of sector we are thinking about, and maybe some sector has to consider the difference between the connection with the international difference of the connection of the international gas market. And we didn't perform, but since the renewable energy sector is really changing the whole Polish domestic energy sector, probably even the electricity market might be changing over time. So for maybe further study, it might be interesting to also consider the effects of the renewable energy. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Kentana. It was a very interesting one. I will raise the first question just to start the discussion, and then I see that I think Niccolò has raised his hand to ask you some questions. My first one is related to the fact that at the beginning of your presentation, you say that there is no clear definition of energy security. And at the end, you end up with a sort of new definition of energy security, which is maybe interesting to go further on, because you say it's highly context dependent. So it would be interesting to provide a sort of metrics of energy security with the different carriers, and to show that energy security is in fact in some regions oil defined, and the main problem is to have access to oil. In some other countries it's coal dependent, in some other countries gas dependent, in some other countries electricity dependent, and to show this energy security issue through the new definition you come up with, which is how to define this concept, which is local, but we can say more things than it's just local or dependent. It's dependent on 3-4 energy carriers, and the ranking of it probably is something that could be highlighted a little bit more. But I really like the paper and the way you build your econometrics and your results. But it's just a sort of we should kill the paper at the end and say, okay, we go a step forward, not only on the mathematics, but also on the economic definition of what is energy security. And you provide a very nice step forward. You go a step further than IAEE, which is just a matter of resource and price. It's a matter of resource and price and of energy vectors. And I think it's a had in your paper that you should. This one is published, but maybe you should try to use your econometric tools to show that energy security could be defined thanks to your results in this paper. So Alex, I see that you have a question, so please.
Thank you. I can't start my video for some reason because it's disabled, but I think that's fine. Thank you so much for the interesting presentation. I have a simple question really, which is sort of partly implied in what you've already presented, but I wondered whether you noticed any price spikes or falls that are consistent with specific international events. The obvious one is COP21 in Paris, indicating perhaps an accelerated decline of the coal industry. And obviously Poland is in the headlines at the moment for grappling with this problem, particularly as Europe's largest source of coal power generation. So I just wondered in the course of your research whether you noticed any correlation with specific diplomatic or market-related events. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the question. So I think we didn't see much of the change yet. Maybe it's still in the time of transition, but still somehow in the mid 1915s, 2015 and 2016, the price has been decreasing. The coal, both, maybe I should share the screen so you can, yeah, in the paper we show that like this is, I think, the coal indices. And also the gas was, maybe it is also related to the little bit decline in the economy in the mid 2015s. And also could be, I'm not sure about the shale gas revolution, but also the natural gas became really low in the 2015 related to the new production in the shale boom, new production from the US. So maybe the coal was also influenced in this time of period. And of course, I think the COVID-19 is also should be a new topic that's very interesting. I think recently the coal price is somehow increasing again, maybe because of the increase in the natural gas and the petroleum price. But so the energy is, dropped in 2015 and again rose before the COVID and then declined again. And now in 2021, it's starting to increase. So maybe now it's more becoming interesting to check this type of effects on the price series. I hope that I didn't answer quite well, but yeah.
So Alex, are you convinced by the answer? Yes, it seems so. The thumbs up seems that he's happy with your answer, Kentana. Is there any question? Any other question? Then I have a second one. Usually, when we are looking at energy markets, there is always the issue of who's setting the price and which technology set the price. And there is the issue of importing prices from the neighbors. So because we are in a common market with different technologies, and from time to time the price is set by the foreigner technology, because you have no congestions between the regions, and it is not the homeland price which applies, but the price of the neighbor. And when your neighbor is Germany, of course, one of the problems is that you, from time to time, you have very high prices because you don't have enough renewables, and sometimes you have very low prices because you have too much renewables. And I was wondering if this effect of renewables impact on the price has an impact on your data and on your treatment.
Definitely. So that would be, I think, the topic that should be pursued, and especially the renewable. It's more, oversupply in the renewable in the Germany. So sometimes Germans are selling their oversupplied renewable energy to other countries. But at least for the case of Poland, that hasn't been started that much. And more, I think the natural gas was imported from Russia. So I think that European effect of the increased renewable is not directly influencing at the moment. And also the Poland itself is also now shifting to renewable energy. So I don't know, but probably not yet so strong at the moment, but of course in the future that might change. Because I think the importance of producing renewable energy is be able to sell the renewable energy when it's oversupplied to other countries. And that way the energy balance is always kept in balance. And in case of Europe, the energy grid is connected beyond the border. So I think that can be possible. Like I'm in Japan, but Japan still doesn't have any border or energy grid outside the country. So we are always suffering. We are producing over supplied renewable energy sometimes, but we can't use that to send it to the more highly demanded area. At least we still even don't have the national connected energy grid within the whole country. So that's always, I think, problem about increasing the renewable energy.
That's correct. Okay, is there any other questions coming from the audience? No, okay. Then thank you very much, Kentana, for your presentation, which was really crystal clear.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy that your paper has been published. So now we are waiting next year to have the coming papers coming from you and your team. It was a very nice one. And now we move to Niccolò. So Niccolò, the floor is yours. You could then share your PowerPoint if.
Yeah, thank you, Yannick. I can't seem to open my video. It says that the host doesn't allow me to switch on my video.
Mr. Host?
I can already.
Yeah, wait a minute. I thought I had opened it for everybody, but
okay, we have it now.
Normally you should be able to open your video. There is no restriction about it.
Somehow I can't. It says that the host has stopped it. But either way, I mean, you can see my presentation, I guess.
Is it okay?
No, it's working perfectly. Huh?
Yeah, okay, thank you. No, it's because I manually deactivated the video, so there were a problem. I'm sorry.
No,
okay, no worries. Okay.
We see it perfectly.
Yeah. Okay, then let me start. So warm welcome also from my side and good morning. This is work that I'm working on together with a lot of other authors, as you can see down below. Some mainly authors also from the MCC Berlin, that's where I'm located, and other authors from the ETH Zurich. And this is a piece that we are currently working on, so it hasn't been published yet. We are actually in the process of writing it up. So that's also why I'm really looking forward to your comments on how to improve the paper, or also any other questions or ideas. And this piece is about public and private finance for coal-fired power plants. And we also want to look into the drivers and try to actually explain the persistence of finance. One slide on the motivation. So coal is actually the largest source of electricity. And as you can see on the graph on the right side, it's also the largest source of primary global emissions. And we see that actually, while many countries in Europe, not Poland, but other countries in Europe and the US are actually phasing out coal, at the same time, there's a higher demand in other countries, for instance, in Asia and also in sub-Saharan Africa. And currently we see a pipeline of new coal-fired power plants of 503 gigawatts, out of which 180 are already under construction. And this is regardless of the national determined contributions and also net zero pledges. And we know from the literature that the pipeline goes along with international finance flows from banks, from state-owned and private banks. And this is regardless of the Paris Agreement, which states in Article 2C to make finance flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions. And now we want to ask two questions in this paper. What are the private and public cross-border finance flows? For that, we analyze finance from state-owned banks and private banks on a global scale. That's something that hasn't been done so far. And as a second step, we want to look into the drivers. So why are banks funding plans overseas? And one hypothesis from the literature is that there's a technology export, so that banks support their domestic industry to go abroad. And we want to test this by analyzing finances in other involved companies. Other involved companies might, for instance, be turbine manufacturers, generation manufacturers, or construction companies. We want to see if there's a domestic bias. So if the finances are from the same countries as the other involved companies, and we want to analyze that on a global scale. Also something that hasn't been done yet so far. To do that, we first had to create one data set out of 4 different data sets. And we used 2 data sets on financing. This is one public finance data set from the Global Energy Monitor and the National Resource Defense Council, and another one from Urgewald. And we merged this financing information with information on power plants from the Global Energy Monitor and information on manufacturers from the World Electric Power Plants database from Platts. And after that, we calculated other things, a lot of other things. And this is basically also the main work of our paper. This actually took a lot of time to compile this data set because we had to do a lot of the mapping manually actually. But I would say that was worth it because what we got was a plant level finance database for public and private finance flows on a global scale, including the manufacturers, construction companies, and other companies for each of the units. Let me just quickly show you an overview of the data. So we only look at units that had a year of commissioning from 2018 onwards, because the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016, and we assumed a lag of at least 2 years between financial agreement and the final commissioning of the plant. And we only look at plants that are operating under construction or permitted, because those are or will most probably be realized. And just to give you a brief overview, we differentiated between domestic and cross-border financing on the left-hand side, and by ownership of bank, so state-owned and private banks. And here you can see for each of the clusters in the matrix, you can see the unique number of unique units that we have finance information for and the financing provided. So in total, we have 188 coal units with $92 billion of financing. And if we look at cross-border flows only, we have 151 units with 65 US dollar billion in financing. And now coming to the coverage. So coverage here implies the share of units that we have financing information for out of the total number of units. And we can again see that there's a large difference between countries. So for China and India, there was a lot of capacity constructed since 2018 or currently in pipeline, and we only cover a really low share. But for most other countries like Vietnam and Indonesia, the share we cover is rather high. So that's why if we look at the coverage by status, we can actually see that if we look at all countries combined, the shares are rather low. But then if we look at the share without China and India, it's much higher. And even so, when we look, for instance, only at plants that are currently under construction. Okay, so now for the next couple of slides, I will show you some of the results that we have so far already. First of all, just an overview of the yearly financial transactions split into domestic and overseas financing by private and state-owned banks. And what we can see, first of all, is that definitely funding continued after the Paris Agreement entered into force in 2016. So this is obvious, but we also see at the same time that there is a strong downward trend. But for 2020, the numbers might actually still increase because the last quarter is still missing in our financing data. What we also see that in our data set, we have more overseas financing. So this is the dark blue and the dark green bars compared to domestic financing. But as I mentioned before, there's a lot of data missing in China and India. And we assume that in those countries, financing is mostly domestically. Then one last takeaway from the slide, that the state-owned banks seem to finance more units overseas as compared to private banks. And private banks seem to finance mostly domestically. So now that we got this overview of domestic versus overseas and private versus public finance, we want to know actually which countries are involved. And now we only look at the overseas finance, so the dark green and the dark blue. This might be a bit of a confusing graph, but I'll walk you through it. So this is the capacity funded overseas, which in total is 65.3 gigawatts. And you can see the colors, blue state-owned and green from private banks. On the left side, you can see the financing countries, and on the right side, the countries that received the financing. So where the units are or will likely be constructed. We can see for financing countries that we have three big ones. That is China, Japan, and South Korea. And for financing countries, many either finance through state-owned or private banks. So for instance, Switzerland, United States, you can see that there's only private banks, but others like India, Russia, only state-owned banks. Now looking at the side countries, we see that they are mostly from Southeast Asia and also some from Sub-Saharan Africa. And we also see that many countries receive financing only from China, which is in line with China's Belt and Road Initiative. So now that we know which countries are financing coal plants overseas, we want to know, we want to look into the drivers. So why are those countries actually financing coal plants overseas? And as I mentioned before, one hypothesis is the technology export. So we are looking in this couple of companies. Here you can see a list of all the companies we consider. So there's the finances, the banks, then there are the insurers, sponsor, which is the developer, so the operator and our owner of the plant, parent company. Then we have turbine generator and steam supply system manufacturers, and the architect, engineering firm, and construction contractor. And so first of all, we want to know if there are often foreign companies involved. So if there's a technology export on a global scale at all. So we look at the share of units where those companies that I just explained to you are domestic only. So domestic means from the same country as where the power plant is constructed, where they're foreign or mixed. And let me explain it to you with the example of turbine manufacturers. So turbine manufacturers are only for 6.2% of the units from the same country as where the plant is constructed. So for most of the units, 94%, it's actually from a foreign country. So we learned here that actually there's a lot of technology import from the countries where the units are constructed. So in general, we see actually a global technology flow. The only difference here is for sponsors and parents, where we see that they are actually mostly from the countries where the unit is constructed, but all the other companies are mostly from foreign countries. So now knowing that there are the global technology flows, we wanted to know which countries are actually exporting their technology. And here's a really colorful graph. So again, you can see each column is a different group of company. So first is finances, insurance, sponsors, and so on. On the left-hand side, you can see the capacity of the unique unit. So the 65.3 gigawatts. And the colors are the different countries. So for finances, as I told you before, the big three, China, Japan, South Korea. And you can see that those countries are also basically involved in all the other companies. So again, let's look at turbine manufacturers. You can see that Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean turbine manufacturer play a big role. But then we also have a lot of EU 27, which in this case is mostly France. We also have a large bar of unknown, because unfortunately the Platts database that we use is not that recent. So a lot of units don't have information yet on the turbine manufacturers, for instance. And we also see the bar other, which is the dark gray, because this graph only shows you the financing countries. So the countries that are not financing countries are in the other bar. So, and now that we know that there's a lot of technology export on a global scale, and we know which countries are involved, we want to know if the companies, so for instance, the turbine manufacturers, are from the same country as the financiers. So if there's a domestic bias. So this is the question that we ask here. If a company is from a financing country, what is the chance that the financier is from the same country as well? And we split that by state-owned and private banks. And again, let me demonstrate with the example of turbine manufacturers. So we can see that if a turbine manufacturer is from a financing country, so let's say Japan, there's a chance of 60% that the bank, if it's state-owned, is also from that country, so from Japan. And we see that the share is way higher for state-owned banks than for private banks. So we actually see for public finance that there is a large domestic bias. And this is the final result slide, because it's not only interesting to look at state-owned versus private banks, but also to look at individual countries. So that's why here we want to know what's the share of unit transactions. So this is transactions, financing transactions linked to the specific units, for that at least one company is from the same country as the financer. And well, the important message here is that for all the state-owned banks, we see a really high share. So for instance, for Japan, 100%, which implies that all units that are financed from Japanese state-owned banks have at least one other company that is also from Japan. And the share of the unit is quite high for all state-owned banks. It looks, though, completely different for private banks, where Japan still has a share of 100%, but most of the other countries, so I only showed the 4 biggest ones here, most of the other countries actually have a share of 0, which implies that, for instance, if there is financing from the United Kingdom, there are no other companies involved from the United Kingdom. So again, for state-owned banks, it seems really high. So there seems to be a domestic bias, and technology export seems to play an important role. For private banks, not so much, except for banks from Japan. Okay, so now some points for discussion. With the current NDCs and also the recent net zero emission pledges from some countries, we see that actually financing of coal plants, domestic or overseas, is not included, because all those, they only focus on domestic emissions. So it's always like domestic emission reductions. But recently, the G7, where Japan is also a member, they agreed to stop direct governmental support, which includes financing for coal plants. But as I've shown you on the graph before, we see that Japan actually also exports a lot of technology through private banks. But still, I mean, this is an important political decision, and it will probably also put pressure on other countries like South Korea and Japan to do the same, and also to stop governmental support, including finance, for coal plants. One important factor which we touch upon in this paper, but we didn't go into detail, is the importance of the political economy aspect. And for instance, it might be important for future work on just transitions to also include the manufacturing sector, because we see here that, for instance, if South Korea wants to withdraw from coal domestically, it's important to also include the South Korean manufacturing sector, so that the sector doesn't go abroad and actually continues to build coal plants overseas. This is my final slide, some takeaway messages. So we've seen that the big overseas financiers are from Japan, South Korea, and China. And that public finance actually seems to correlate with technology exports. For Japan, the technology exports also seems to be the case with private finance. And the political development in the future is unknown at the moment. So I mentioned that the G7 agreed to phase out financial support, but it's unknown how that's going to develop. And future research. So one thing that seems to be important to look at is actually the interplay of banks and companies. So does the bank, for instance, approach the domestic company to go abroad, or is it more that the company comes first and then the banks chips in? So this is something that we want to figure out, and we might also conduct some interviews to actually back up our findings and also to get more insight into this interplay. But this is something that we still have to decide on. And as I mentioned, the political economy in the financing countries is really important. So for instance, can this technology export be linked to domestic over coal capacity? Those are things that we can still look at. And then also the policy implications of all of this. So what does it actually mean? And what could be potential policy instruments to go against this international finance flows? These are all things that can still be discussed in the future. And as I mentioned before, we are currently in the process of writing this paper. So I'm really looking forward to any comments, suggestions, or ideas from your side. Thank you.
Thank you, Niccolò, for this very nice paper and presentation. It was very fascinating. I have made some photographs of your slides, and I put them on Twitter because I think they are very, very interesting. You'd see it's for me a real interesting and hot topic to clearly identify the financial links plus the strategies behind. And what you did is very, very interesting. I'm very enthusiastic about your work. And I was wondering if you cannot maybe make a small detour for looking at international relation strategy, something like that, to see there is some typologies already existing on forms of cooperation between between companies, states, and finance, to see if the configuration you discovered are totally new, or if they are well known in international relations, and to look at it from let's say a step back perspective, and say, okay, as usual, the Chinese strategy is like this. As usual, the Japanese strategy is like this. The Korean is like this. The European is like that. Because I have the feeling that it's probably not random. And I have the feeling that it's pretty much well organized, and it looks like reflecting, I don't know if it's an implicit strategy or an explicit strategy, or I don't know which type of name you could add on this strategy, but I'm pretty sure it is not random. And I'm pretty sure that you could find typologies coming from political science or from international relations science to give you a sort of wording typology of these forms of cooperation between private and public, or private finance, public finance, plus technology, plus state, plus it seems that there is some possible cumulative strategies for different actors, which are organized or not. I'm pretty sure in Germany there is a strategy to combine industry, innovation, and finance, which is a sort of a big difference between France and Germany. But it seems that for Korea, for Japan, for China, this strategy has been pushed at a higher level, including state and maybe a political economy, even more strategy of having access to resources or to energy. So it's a sort of advice to, I know that you are already doing a lot of things, but I think that it's worth the cost to have a backup and not to discover it. I would prefer that your paper did not discover something which is already known in political science since decades. And I would probably prefer that you say, okay, in political science, there is this typology or these facts which are said to be true, and we are going to check if it is the case. And if it is the case, then your paper is stronger because you prove a link that is already existing, which is better than discovering a link that everybody knows except economists. Of course, as we are economists, it's a bias, it's a professional bias. But I think for publishing your paper, you would increase the quality of the publication just by adding this small literature review on international relations models, and then say, okay, then we do the econometrics we build a database and we do the econometrics to answer this question, even if it's not true. It's the story you tell in the paper, and I think it's a very nice story that a lot of very good reviews could buy.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a great recommendation. Yeah, and then might also go along because we wanted to look into the financing countries more individually and like try to look into political economy and explain why they behave this way. And there, this literature might actually be really helpful. So thank you for that.
Because if you succeed to make it simple, the Journal of Political Economy could be a good place to try to publish it.
Okay, thank you.
Which is not a too bad review. Okay, Alex, you have comments and remarks to give to Niccolò?
Yes, thank you, Yannick. And it is along similar lines, actually, I was going to make a comment, suggesting as well, bringing in either an international relations perspective or similar, because this analysis would apply in very interesting ways to this. In terms of potential extensions or things that would be really interesting to look at, obviously China is front and center of this analysis, just in terms of absolute levels of financing. And there's been a lot of interesting work, particularly by Johns Hopkins, so Johannes Opalainen and Thomas Hale at Oxford, on what's really going on with project financing through the Belt and Road Initiative. And depending on the data kind of quality at a granular level, you could start to look at hypotheses around, for example, it's been suggested that one of the reasons that so many overseas coal plants are being financed through Chinese state-owned enterprises and banks is domestic overcapacity. So it's an attempt to offload excess materials in the construction and operation of plants. And of course, there's a strategic dimension to that as well. I wonder whether, some really detailed case study work on 3 or 4 interesting cases, for example, would help shed light on that. And another dimension as well, and this is something that's really a hypothesis. It's not been possible to demonstrate empirically because data for China is so hard to come by, is the difference between national level state banks and state-owned enterprises and provincial level. Because in many cases, Chinese provinces are able to issue debt and invest in projects at a provincial level. Many of these provinces are facing significant debt overhangs from 2008. And it's been suggested that one of the reasons that they're kind of committing all this financing is basically to earn revenues to be able to meet those debt payments. And a lot of them are coming mature around now. So it's a very high risk strategy for a lot of provincial governments, which may be overextending themselves. And that can also be happening in direct contradiction to central government policy. So there's a lot of interesting things to look at in China specifically, I think, but obviously data is an issue. But just some suggestions, and thanks for the very interesting presentation.
Yeah, thank you. Those are definitely also great ideas. Yeah, we were hoping that we can maybe conduct some interviews with with people from the financing countries, and then maybe we can also touch upon those things where there's provincial, where the state-owned banks, and also the domestic overcapacity would be great to include this. I guess in the end, it's also a question of how much more time do we want to spend on the paper and how big should it get. But thanks for the ideas.
I think as you are creating a new database, I think you should, if it's possible for you to keep on working on it a bit, because if you add new elements in this new database, connecting it with other database, you could have a strength of paper which never ends. For instance, you could once you will have finished, of course, but you could cross this database with the World Value Survey. Which is making a lot of assumptions about how people believe on different criteria motivates them to do things or not. So if you cross your exporting or importing countries with the values of each countries, you may have nice results. If you look at Polity 4 or 5 indicators of institutional structures, You could also try to see if there is a link between the strategy and the institutions in the country that sends the money and in the country that receives it. And try to check if the sender and the receiver are in the same institutional dynamics, or and then they understand each other better than if it's totally different. You could also look at Transparency International to see the ranking of these countries or doing business. So there is a lot of database around, but once yours is settled, you make cross-link with others, and each time you make a cross-link, you make a paper. And I know that when we are in a database, what we want is to end up and to throw it away to start something new. But before doing that, I think it's worth the cost to fully test your database with the other around which are existing and which are well known, and to try to extract some more fruits from your database by linking it with other ones which are already used elsewhere, and that could shed a new type of lights in your database. And I know that we want to push them away and to start something new because we somehow will get bored. But in fact, it's there is also there is something new that you could do in your database just by linking yours with others and to exploit these things. And as long as you have your database as the main reference, you are always producing something new. So it's always highly publishable.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually something I didn't really think about yet.
And if you ask colleagues around you on the international database that you could use to, that they are using to do things as control variables, etc., you will see that there is a lot of database that which are accessible for free. And as long as you have yours, the combination of yours plus the World Value Survey or Polity or whatsoever, you bring new things in your analysis for almost for free, and it's not consuming too much time. Because these databases are already, let's say, large enough to be connected with yours.
Yeah, thank you. I would definitely look into that.
But it means that you are going to spend a little bit more time on your.
Yeah, I'm not sure I want to do that. Let's see.
Oh, but for joint works, if you discuss with people which have this type of database, it's an easy connection for them to use yours and for you to use them, and it's a source of joint papers that you must consider. Of course, it depends on your own strategy regarding your future, but it's an economy of scale that you might consider.
I will, thank you.
The white air in the room, it's me, so it's a free advice. Okay, thank you, Niccolò. It was a very nice presentation, and now we are going to switch for the last presentation of this session, coming from Alex. So Alex, could you display your screen? Oh, great, it works. Perfect.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, can you make it full screen?
Yeah, I'm just gonna put the, okay, does that work okay?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'll try and keep it to 20 minutes, but it's good to know that there's a minute or two of flexibility, but I'll try and keep as much time as possible for questions. So thanks very much. Over the next few minutes, I'll be walking you through a plant level analysis of the employment and fiscal impacts of coal phase out in China, work that was conducted as part of a series of papers on the coal transition in China, funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So I do have sort of co-authors working on different parts of this analysis as well. But today I'm just going to focus on this specific component. So I'll start with a bit of context on China, climate and coal transition, followed by a brief review of international experience with coal phase out and the socioeconomic challenges associated with it. I'll present how I've modeled the employment and fiscal impacts of coal phase out in China, present some of the main findings and how they change in response to different coal transition scenarios, a very brief detour on case studies in the Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang regions of China, and I'll conclude with some policy implications and thoughts for further research. So, for those unfamiliar with coal power in China, since 2005, China has produced more annual greenhouse gas emissions than any other country. And as of this year or last year, I think, China is home to over half of the world's coal power generation capacity, which, as you can see from this graphic, is concentrated in the eastern and southeastern areas. So each black dot is one plant. With the strongest growth in capacity recently being seen in the large northern and western regions of Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang, and the central province of Shanxi, which are highlighted in yellow in the figure. And as you're probably aware, China has also made some striking and actually largely unexpected announcements in the past few years that will require a radical overhaul of its entire economy. So in September last year, President Xi announced a 2060 carbon neutrality target and a peak in emissions before 2030. So to the extent that the central government succeeds in enacting these policies, a near total coal phase out in China affecting the majority of the current fleet is pretty inevitable. And it should in principle have an immediate and growing effect on coal power generation and planning, as well as generation from existing plants. And interestingly, the kind of progressive mechanization and centralization of coal production in China has already been associated with a continuous decline in employment across the various parts of the value chain. So China will need to transition at least some of its workers with skill sets relevant to coal production towards zero carbon energy production and manufacturing. And short-term measures to replace the tax revenues from coal might include transition funding from central or supranational governments, but in the long term, governments really must find ways of replacing tax revenues from coal with other sources without unnecessarily slowing the development of clean energy and production by taxing it excessively. But just to give you some idea of the numbers, direct employment by coal companies in China has declined already from a peak of about 5.3 million in 2013 to 3.2 million just 5 years later. So that's 2 million jobs gone in 5 years. And interestingly, the disparity in labor intensity of coal production across provinces suggests that many more jobs will become victims of automation in the coming years, almost independent of climate policy. So this is one of the hypotheses that we're exploring in this work. And notably, the labor intensity of the most labor efficient province, which is in Mongolia, is actually similar to that of Germany, suggesting that actually the much higher figures for other provinces are likely to converge on this kind of more efficient yardstick as economies of scale and automation and so on do their work. So turning very briefly to the experience with the decline of coal outside China, one feature of the coal transition or the canary in the coal mine, so to speak, has been the decline of coal mining, which in the UK had all but concluded by the 1990s, driven by domestic industry economics and political confrontation between the government and mining unions, but also dwindling domestic supplies. And in the European Union today, direct employment in coal mining has halved in a decade, and almost 2/3 of the remaining jobs are in Poland. And total employment in all coal-related jobs in the EU is about 240,000 as of 3 years ago, which is less than 0.1% of total employment in the region across all sectors. And in the US, coal mining now contributes just 40,000 jobs in 2020, less than half what it was 10 years ago. And coal power plant generation jobs are about 80,000. So even putting those together, you've got about 120,000, which compares to 360,000 jobs in wind and solar generation alone in the same year. So the trajectory for energy sector employment seems quite clear from these countries that are arguably ahead of the curve relative to China at the moment. So previous work on coal phase out in China has really focused mostly on the financial implications for coal companies, using the term stranded asset sometimes, but also other framings. But it's really paid less attention to some of the other key priorities of government, such as employment, equity, and public finances. And coal also often supports entire communities locally in a relatively small number of areas with highly concentrated employment in the industry. So the coal phase-out measures can actually have very localized effects and lead to all sorts of social issues, but also the declining provision of public and private goods that are funded by local taxation in these areas. And since net taxes, so accounting for subsidies, are actually relatively small, the primary difficulty for China's government is probably not going to be macroeconomic stability or growth, but really the reallocation of fiscal support, labor, skills, and investment, which really demonstrates the opportunity of creating, the importance of creating alternative opportunities for people facing redundancy and understanding how coal companies facing labor reallocation and retraining needs can use or adapt their existing skills to other tasks or industries. So turning to the model, to assess the potential employment and fiscal effects of coal phase out in China, I constructed a model that links employment in the coal power sector and coal mining industries to the building and retirement schedule of plants from this year out to 2060, the carbon neutral date. I'll explain how specific employment and tax revenues are estimated in a second, but just first, let's have a quick look at how consumption and production are distributed. So this figure, as I showed you earlier, shows the distribution of coal plants consuming coal, but power generation and coal mining are distributed very differently across China. So the three provinces, Inner Mongolia, Shanxi, and Shanxi, one with 2 A's and one with 1 A, account for 70% of coal production, but no single province has more than 10% of coal power generation. Detailed data on coal trading between provinces wasn't available. So what I've done is assume that each province produces the same ratio of thermal to non-thermal coal. It satisfies its own internal demand for coal, and it imports coal from other provinces to cover the shortfall according to the distribution of supplies remaining once each province meets its internal demand. So in effect, that means that the three largest coal producers I've highlighted supply 97% of the interprovincial coal trade market. And this is also adjusted for imports. So China imported about 1/5 of its coal in 2019. Thermal coal is 70% of imports from sources like Australia, for example. So the proportion of thermal coal demand met domestically is about 85%. Just to kind of break down how I estimated these different figures, I basically assumed a fixed number of jobs per plant according to the plant size in the plant operation, which produces a figure of about 500,000 jobs nationally in coal plant operation, which is consistent with national estimates I found. And I also assumed that the labor intensity of coal mining converges on the Inner Mongolia figure of 1.7 jobs per 10,000 tons of additional production by 2050. So what that means is that more jobs will be lost to efficiency in the short term than to plant closures. Income taxes and social security payments are raised from employee wages. There are also resource taxes, which are a percentage of coal sales, mining royalties, land use royalties, and taxes associated with specific air pollutants, which are all collected by provinces, and then value-added tax and income tax is collected by the central government. Now, of course, there are very significant unpriced negative externalities, carbon emissions, but also local emissions. Some of these local emissions are local pollutant emissions are priced, but at a very low level. Previous research shows that the actual cost, the social cost, is very significant for coal, but we've put it beyond the scope of this analysis for now. So we're really just looking at financial flows coming in and out of central and provincial government. It's not possible with the available data to measure subsidies on a plant level basis, but what I've done instead is to estimate subsidies nationally by combining subsidies for R&D, VAT rebates, direct power price subsidies and relocation funding, and compared that in aggregate to estimated taxes. There are, of course, potential additional subsidies that will be needed to compensate the owners of stranded coal assets, etc., but we haven't considered that since it's quite hypothetical. We have a baseline scenario that reflects current policies where coal plants are built and retired according to their intended lifetimes, which is about 30 years. This isn't necessarily in line with science-based emissions targets, but it is consistent with Chinese government modeling, at least for now. We've got 3 alternative scenarios, which are actually designed to follow previous work by He et al. I can give you the reference if you're interested. But basically, there's the first alternative scenario has the cost of renewables in future being lower than expected, which helps accelerate the phase out of coal. And in the C50 and C80 scenarios, coal capacity declines in absolute terms quite quickly to meet a power sector emissions constraint of 50% and 80% below 2015 levels, respectively, which implies shorter plant lifetimes. I can come back to this in questions if there's interest in the detail, but this is just a very quick overview. So to the results, this figure shows baseline scenario estimates for employment in the coal power industry over the next 40 years, broken down by components. So this is mining and in plants. So employment in coal mines starts at a fairly high level, 1.4 million roughly, but it follows a fairly steep downward trajectory, declining about 50% by 2035 for the next 15 years. Employment in plants is much lower, but it falls by less than 30% in the same period, partly because the mining jobs are subject to declining labor intensity, whereas the plant jobs are not. And about half of coal mining jobs are not actually in the province where the coal is consumed. So about half of mining employment in China is actually for exports to other provinces. So what we can see is up to about the mid-2030s, you've got a steady decline. And then from that point, job losses in plants start to accelerate as plants start to go offline, retiring, slowing again in the 2040s, and then declining to zero in the mid-2050s as the wave of plants built around now reach the end of their life. So total coal power industry employment is projected to drop below 1 million by 2036, halving again by 2042 and halving again by 2045. And just for comparison, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences estimates that by 2050, and this is probably a conservative estimate, you'll have at least 400,000 jobs in wind and solar industries, with another 3.5 million jobs kind of indirectly linked to that. So the direction of travel is very similar to the EU and US. The trajectory of fiscal revenues, of tax revenues, does not decline as sharply, and it actually rises slightly in the short term. So this dark blue line is everything added to, well, the dark blue line is the national level taxes, and then the light blue line is subnational. But yeah, total revenues rise initially because coal capacity doesn't peak until 2023, and the taxes on capital are actually a greater proportion of total revenue than taxes on labor. So income taxes contribute about 1% of revenue from coal, mining royalties about 1%. The lion's share is actually VAT, value-added tax, about 200 billion yuan, which is, yeah, and then for provincial governments, it's resource taxes on coal sales that generate the majority of revenue. Pollution taxes are about 7%, and pollution taxes on mines another 6%. And when you compare this to the estimated annual subsidy level, which is about 300 to 350 billion yuan annually, the total tax take of about 260 billion suggests that actually the coal industry is already a net fiscal drain on the Chinese government, and it will probably become more so as the revenues associated with coal capital assets start to fall, as we can see happening after about the mid-2030s in this graphic. Under progressively stricter scenarios, the short-term drop in coal capacity needed to meet the target requirements becomes increasingly large. And of course, this is just one of many ways of reaching the medium and long-term goals around which the scenarios are calibrated. But ultimately, any ambitious scenario will require a significant drop in capacity and associated jobs and revenues quite soon. So comparing the trajectory of coal employment and revenues under different scenarios, you can see that under the R scenario, dark green here, there's relatively little impact on total employment. So it's just 100,000 fewer jobs in 2030 relative to the brown baseline. And under the C50 scenario, which implies a coal phase out by 2040, there's about 750 additional job losses against the baseline. Under the C80 scenario, it's over 1 million. So there's a fairly significant difference once you're looking at about 10 years. So the C50 and C80 scenarios are the gold and light green lines here. Total tax revenues are actually quite stable up to 2030 under the R scenario, where accelerated renewables deployment, and they decline very rapidly thereafter, following much the same trajectory as the baseline, but at just sort of 5 years sooner. So the graph is just shifted to the left, essentially. And in the C50 and C80 scenarios, it's the same story. It's just that the decline in tax revenue starts earlier, 11 and 16 years, actually, to be precise. So the additional job losses associated with a more ambitious coal target are actually relatively minor until you start seeking sort of very significant absolute emissions reductions targets. But interestingly, that even the rate of job losses, even under the C80 scenario, the most ambitious, is slower than the rate of job losses that China has seen in the last 5 or 6 years, recalling that 2 million jobs have already been lost in the coal industry. So it's the timing rather than the rate of tax revenue decline that's most affected by different scenarios. Okay, moving swiftly on, because I know I'm getting close to time. Part of the study was a couple of case studies on key regions. So Inner Mongolia is the largest coal producing province in China, and it's also fast becoming the largest consumer of coal too. It's got more than 100 gigawatts now of coal capacity. It also exports about 2/3 of its coal to other provinces, and it meets on its own about 40% of total interprovincial demand for coal. And despite its massive mining and combustion operations, because it's so labor efficient, the total number of jobs is actually only about 140,000. Jingxinji is actually shorthand for Beijing, Hebei, and Tianjin provinces. It's a heavily urbanized region with a population of conservatively 112 million, but probably more like 130 now. And in Beijing's case, the city actually no longer contains any coal mines. It recently closed its last coal-fired power plant. Across the 3 provinces, there's about 70 gigawatts of capacity. But in contrast, in Mongolia, it doesn't plan to build any more capacity, and we'll actually see its capacity decline as existing plants are closed. But the key difference is that the labor intensity of coal mining in Hebei is more than 13 times that of Inner Mongolia. So despite having half as much coal capacity, the coal plants in Hebei support twice as many local coal mining jobs. So here I kind of compare the employment figures in mining and in coal plants between the two. So you can see that it starts much higher in Inner Mongolia, just given the scale. But they converge, the numbers converge very sharply to within 15,000 of each other in jobs terms by 2040, primarily. So you can see that plant jobs, which are the orange lines, are declining steadily in Jingxinji as plants retire. And in Inner Mongolia, employment in plants is quite stable until the early 2030s, and then declines very sharply to 2040 and reaches net zero in the mid 2050s. Yannick, I know I've got about 2 minutes left. I should make it just about.
In fact, we are very comfortable in terms of time management, so don't.
Okay.
And if you need 5 more minutes, there is no problem.
Perfect. Okay. Well, I'll slow down my speaking because I think that would probably help those on the call. And then just turning to tax revenues in Inner Mongolia, the tax revenues from the mining of coal supplied to other provinces actually elevate the fiscal significance of coal power to the province. So supplying coal to other provinces adds about 11 billion yuan annually to provincial tax revenue, which brings the provincial revenues to about 18 billion in total once you account for supplying domestic plants. And this also adds about 12 billion yuan annually to central government revenues from coal produced for export, which brings the total contribution to central tax revenues to about 27 billion, which is approximately 10% of the national total. And you can see a similar phenomenon here where the actual revenues are peaking about 3 years from now, because at least based on current construction trends, that's when China's likely to hit maximum coal capacity. So just very briefly, to summarize, we've seen in this research that many coal jobs will be lost in China by 2050, but actually this is largely driven by declining labor intensity rather than necessarily climate policy, which is quite a nice story, insofar as it says this is essentially going to happen anyway. Climate policy will have a fairly marginal impact. So, you know, this transition needs to be prepared for regardless of climate policy. So China might think about focusing on identifying ways of scaling up employment and tax revenues from zero emissions industries or substitutes that can make use of existing human capital. And as I've noted, the total number of mining and plant jobs at risk by 2050 is actually less than the total number of jobs shed just from 2014 to 2020. And even under the most ambitious scenario, coal employment doesn't fully disappear for another 15 years, which implies job losses at less than half the rate experienced recently. So the labor transition challenge facing China is significant, of course, but it's not unprecedented at all. The replacement of fiscal revenues tied to coal actually presents quite different challenges. So nationally, about 80% of total tax revenues linked to coal power flow to the central government, and they remain quite stable until the mid-2030s in the baseline scenario. But as you become more and more ambitious with your climate policy, the urgency of finding ways to replace those revenues becomes more significant, but, notwithstanding China's ability to finance it through borrowing and debt. And for large coal producers, particularly Inner Mongolia, provincial governments receive closer to 40% of total tax revenues. And since provincial governments and state-owned enterprises linked to provincial governments are relatively financially independent and they can issue their own debt, they are quite the liability for the central government if they're unable to meet their obligations due to excessive borrowing to finance coal expansion. So the risk of defaults and the size of liabilities is greater for more ambitious phase-out scenarios for these provinces, of which Inner Mongolia is sort of representative. Another kind of key conclusion is that the magnitude of non-externality subsidies to the coal industry is similar to the magnitude of total tax revenues, which started about 260 billion and fall after 2023. Which implies that the net fiscal effect of coal phase-out might actually be revenue neutral or positive. So the role of central government is not necessarily in plugging the gap, contradicting myself earlier, but it's more about redistribution of the sort of potential net benefits of phasing out coal in fiscal terms. So central fiscal support to the provinces to aid their transition could be essential to weakening the destructive incentives for coal expansion in mining regions, which I won't go into, but happy to discuss. And in the long term, ways of taxing clean technologies will be needed to an extent to replace the resource taxes tied to coal sales that represent the majority of provincial revenue. So with that, just some thoughts on further research, because this is ongoing. I'm spending the summer at the IAEE Research Institute to try and do some interesting stuff with this. Oxford is soon publishing a plant level data sets in steel and cement, which I hope to be able to add to this to complement it. Other avenues for looking into this research in more detail include looking at plant ownership, so which state-owned enterprises, because they are mostly state-owned enterprises, own which plants, employ which people, and pay which taxes, and how does that change at the company level over time, which companies are most exposed. How changes in local demand filter through the coal value chain, and then finally looking in more detail at the provincial dynamics. So trying to understand what the stranded labor problem means for provincial job markets and understanding the impact of declining tax revenues on local investment. So thank you for your indulgence for going over time, and happy to take questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting and very impressive, Alex. It's a huge amount of data that you have presented and comment. So first, congratulations before entering into any questioning, etc., etc. It's in French we say tour de force to have raised up a so nice presentation. So really congratulations. In fact, I have only one remark or question. I don't know, or statement. I don't know in which classification my comments will fit best. But in fact, what is striking is the fact that, as you say, it's mainly a redistributive issue. And I was thinking that with coal, it's always a matter of redistribution. If we look at Germany, at Spain, at Poland, at England, it's always been a source of let's say redistribution issues. It's not. We see that we could say that there is millions of jobs in the energy transition and millions of jobs in the coal that needs to be replaced. But of course, for the people which are in the coal mines to become solar PV technicians or to become I don't know electrical engineer or I don't know. Usually in the coal mines, the job are very simple, very tough, but very simple for most people. And to transform them into more high-level technicians turns to be a challenge. So it has been the case in Germany, it has been the case in Spain, it has been the case in England. What do you do with the workers? And 2 million people, it's quite, for China, it's not too much, but it's still 2 million people that you have to work with. So if you stop putting new people and you are just waiting, these people get older and go retire, it's one solution. But if you want to go faster than that, you need to think about how to reorganize and to reallocate these people to jobs they can perform. So I was wondering if, in fact, it's this issue of sunk cost or accepting to destroy revenues to create new ones. It's not the key. The key question in coal, and someone has to pay for. We see the bill in Germany. It's 38 billion euros to close the coal mines. I don't know if there is an equivalent in England to close the coal mines. I don't know if there is an equivalent in Spain or in the US or in China. But we are stuck by the level of capital destruction, which is not always clear when we say energy transition. We see something like being very positive. We are going to invest in renewables, in solar PV, blah, blah, blah. But it's still unclear how many losses and how many billions of stranded assets are the counterpart of these new technologies. And I was wondering if it was not a sort of focus to try to better understand this this treatment of the people which are set aside, how they are treated, what are the plans for them, etc., etc. But I don't know if it's economics or social. But when we deal with redistribution issues, we are not always very comfortable as economists because we look for efficiency, but with redistribution, we usually we are less equipped, let's say. So I don't know if it's a question or remark or a comment or. But
it's probably all of them.
Yeah.
I've got some responsive if that's okay. But did you have anything to add? Sorry.
No. It's the end of my main remark.
Great. Yes. No. Absolutely. The redistributive issue is a thorny one for economists because you do need to take an ethical position at the end of the day. There's been what I didn't quite have time to cover is how this kind of fits into existing research in this area, and there's some really fascinating economic history work being done at the LSE that looks at the persistent socioeconomic effects of former coal mining regions in the UK. And these are coal mines that closed 100 years ago, and you can track basically the socioeconomic harm over generations, such that the differences in income and all sorts of indicators is still persistent today. So, there's more recent evidence from Spain, for example, in the Asturias region in the north. Spain recently closed half of its coal plants, sort of by choice, sort of not by choice. That's a whole different story. But the primary tool that was used was early retirement, which might work on paper, and it's an expensive way of dealing with the problem, and it doesn't solve the issue which has plagued the UK, which is inability to replace the kind of key industry in these regions with new investment. That's exactly what's happened in Wales. You've got all sorts of issues in the present, despite the mines closing 30 years ago, because there hasn't been a replacement industry, essentially. And there's a kind of all sorts of identity issues that tie people very closely to the coal mining industry. It's difficult to say how much of that is also true in China. But just on your second point on the labor transition, some of my colleagues at Oxford, Penny Mealy and Anna Berryman, have done some very brilliant analysis on the US, looking at, how do you transition specific skill sets from a brown economy to a green economy in the most efficient way, both spatially and in terms of, the actual difference in skills required. So what is it about working in a coal mine that makes you good at potentially something else? It might not be renewables, it could be completely different things. So they've done a really good analysis on the US, but as with any study on the US, the reason they do it is because the data is good. Yeah. And for China, it's very, very difficult to get detailed labor market information. But that's a really, really interesting complement to this work, because it starts to suggest how do you redeploy those skills. And then just finally, in China, the central government established a 100 billion yuan fund for the transition, for the coal transition a few years ago. Not all of it has been drawn down, and requests for funding have come from a fairly select group of provinces, but that's primarily been relocation funding. So it's shifting miners or coal plant workers to other parts of the business, because usually it's a national state-owned enterprise with plants everywhere, to where labor is needed. But now they're facing the point where people will just have to be laid off, and they won't be able to find jobs in adjacent industries. So, yes, 2 million jobs have already been lost, and China has dealt with that. But that doesn't mean that the next 2 million jobs are going to be the same experience. And actually, sorry, just one more point, particularly because you raised Germany. Some of my other colleagues at Oxford have done analysis. It depends what you're counting. If you're just looking at how the state's earning and spending revenues, that's one thing. But once you start thinking about natural capital loss, depending on what you're counting, it makes total sense to phase out coal in Germany because of the net social benefit being so large, which doesn't deal with the practical problem of replacing tax revenues. But if you are a social planner and you are a sort of social economist, that's what you should be looking at. And actually, it does make complete sense on that front, and probably even more so in China. So thank you. That's I hope that helps.
Yeah, clearly, yes. Thank you very much. I will look the reference carefully that you provided with your colleagues. Thank you. Niccolò, you have raised your hand. You have a question?
I have a question, yes. Yeah, thanks, Alex, for this really interesting and relevant presentation and the results as well. And I would assume that the results are especially relevant also for policymakers in China on the central and also regional level. So I was actually wondering if you or other people from your group are in touch with policymakers and what your experience is, if you would tell them those results, for instance.
That's a great question. So I'm part of a project called the Economics of Energy Innovation and Systems Transition, which is basically trying to change the way energy policy is made and formulated in China, but also in Brazil and India and the EU. In China, it's always difficult to reach policymakers. There are all sorts of reasons that make it so. And the current UK-China diplomatic relations aren't particularly good for all sorts of reasons as well. On top of that, it's quite easy to have conversations on renewables and on offshore wind development and things like that. But coal transition is quite a sensitive subject. And it's even more sensitive right now because I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but a few weeks ago, China released the results of its 2020 census, which basically shows that the population has essentially peaked and will be declining some years earlier than they expected, which has all sorts of implications for the future labor force. So it's, there are actually some very positive messages for the central government to take away from this in the context of the overall transition. But we have to tread very carefully in order not to provoke a negative response, because these, particularly at the provincial level, these are very sensitive issues at the moment, even if the scale of the challenge is not impossible to meet by any means.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Niccolò. Is there other question in the room? Okay, so thank you very much for attending this session, both all of you. Thanks to the three speakers to have presented very nice, clear, and interesting papers on a hot topic. So I really thank you for this effort.